For 30 years, the same man had shown up to the shelter on Clement Street before anyone else arrived, and stayed until everyone else had gone home. He did not have a title. He did not have a parking spot with his name on it. He had a folding chair behind the kitchen pass-through, a short canvas apron he laundered himself every Thursday night, and a way of moving through a room full of hard luck and exhaustion that made people sitting at the long tables feel for an hour at least like they were somewhere that wanted them. His name was Amos, and nobody at the Clement Street Community Shelter had ever once wondered why he came. That was the kind of man he was. You just accepted him the way you accepted gravity. The way you accepted the sound of the coffee urn at 6 in the morning, the way you accepted that if Amos was in the building, the morning would start right, and the food would be ready, and the guests would be greeted, without ceremony and without condescension, which is harder than it sounds. He had been doing this since before the current director was old enough to drive. He had been doing this before the youngest volunteer on staff had been born. He had missed a grand total of 4 Saturdays in 30 years, 2 for a hospitalization that he had described to Paulette on the phone as a minor thing, and that had in fact been a cardiac scare, requiring 2 nights of observation, 2 for funerals. And he had called ahead each time to arrange coverage and left a handwritten note with the schedule for whoever was stepping in. Nobody had thought much about any of that because Amos did not invite thinking about. He arrived, he cooked, he served, he listened, he cleaned, and he went home on the bus, and the next Saturday he did it again. And then one Saturday he did not come. And that was the night everything changed. If you have someone in your life who shows up without fail, every time, for years, you know exactly what it costs the world to lose that quiet. Stay close, because this story is going to remind you what faithfulness looks like when nobody is watching, and what it looks like when somebody finally is. Amos had turned 78 in March, a birthday he acknowledged by making himself a bowl of rice pudding with a little nutmeg the way his mother had made it when he was small, and then going to bed at his usual hour of 9:30. He lived alone in the apartment on Dunbar Avenue that he had shared for 41 years with his wife, Cora, before she passed. The apartment was the same now as it had been then in most of the ways that mattered. The same curtains she had picked out at the fabric store on Madison Avenue, a deep blue-green that she had called peacock, and he had called whatever you say. And that had faded over 11 years from rich to soft without losing the colour entirely, just becoming a quieter version of itself. The same cast-iron skillet on the back burner, seasoned black, older than his marriage, inherited from his own mother. The same 5 steps between the front door and the kitchen that he could navigate in the dark without touching a wall, a distance he had measured in his body over 4 decades until it was less a path and more a reflex. He had kept all of it because changing things felt like erasing her, and he was not ready to do that, and he had made his peace with that uncertainty a long time ago. The peace was not a thing he had found once and kept. It was a thing he remade, regularly, and some mornings it came easier than others. He lived on a fixed income, a small pension from the 32 years he had worked maintenance at a public school district 2 counties over, keeping the boilers running and the hallways intact and the gymnasium floor refinished every third, because children deserve a floor that does not splinter under their knees, and a social security check that covered the rent on Dunbar Avenue and left approximately $40 a month for... He did not complain about this, not because the tightness did not register, but because complaining was not a gear he possessed. He bought rice in bulk from the grocery 3 blocks over, the 20-pound bag that lasted him the better part of 2 months. He repaired his shoes twice before replacing them, a skill he had learnt it from his father, who had learned it from his own father, the knowledge passing through the men in his family like a quiet inheritance. He walked to the bus because the bus was free for seniors, and walking kept his joints from stiffening, or had kept them from stiffening until recently. And he believed in the walking the way he believed in most things, as a plain fact requiring no decoration and no sentimentality about it. The shelter was 3 bus stops and a 4-block walk from his apartment, and he made that trip every Saturday morning with a small canvas bag holding his apron, The container of spice blend he had mixed at home the night before, because the shelter's spice rack had always been inadequate, and he had stopped. Waiting for that situation to change 12 years ago, and sometimes a piece of fruit or a roll he had made Friday evening for the walk. He was at the shelter by 7:15. The first guests arrived at 8. Amos used that 45 minutes to inventory what was in the walk-in, make a mental plan for the day's meal with what was available, and get the coffee going. He moved through those tasks the way a man moves, who has done a thing so many times that his body holds the pattern without instruction from his mind. There was a particular satisfaction in that, in the way a practiced thing feels like the cleanest version of itself, the way a musician finds the note without searching for it. He had never described that satisfaction to anyone, because no one had asked, and he was not the kind of man who offered descriptions of his interior without an invitation. He had started at Clement Street the same fall his son Marcus left for college. Cora had suggested gently, the way Cora did most things that mattered, over dinner on a Sunday evening when the apartment felt too quiet without a teenager in the next room. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful but pointed, that keeps catching your attention the way a sound in the wall does. She said he needed somewhere to put his hands, somewhere with people in it. And he had resisted the way he sometimes resisted her suggestions out of a stubbornness he could never fully justify. And she had not pushed, and he had sat with it for 3 days. And on the Thursday he looked up the shelter on Clement Street. And on the Saturday he went. He had walked in not knowing a single soul, put on a borrowed apron that was too short across the chest, and spent the next 4 hours helping a woman named Doretta plate 260 servings of beef stew without being asked twice for anything. Doretta had a system and he learned it inside of 40 minutes, and by the end of the morning she was handing him things without looking up. He drove home that day, which he still did then, and told Cora over dinner that he would be going back. She had not said anything, just passed him the bread, and in passing it had communicated everything. He had gone back the next Saturday. He had been going back for 30 years. Cora had come with him twice in the early years, and he had watched her move through that kitchen with the ease of a woman who was comfortable being useful anywhere, and he had loved her with a specific gratitude in those hours that he still carried when he thought about those 2 Saturdays. She passed 11 years ago, a Thursday in October, from a heart condition that had been quiet for decades before it declared itself. The quiet of it before was the thing that had surprised him most, that something so catastrophic had been living in her all those years without a sound. He had thought about that in the months afterward, lying awake in the apartment while the peacock curtains held their colour in the dark. He had kept going to Clement Street on the Saturdays after she died, first because he did not know what else to do with himself, and then because it had become the architecture of his week, the thing that gave the other 6 days a reason to hold their shape. The rhythm of Saturday carried Monday through Friday the way a keystone carries an arch, not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. Without it, the week would have been a different shape entirely, and he was not sure it would have held. He had never articulated this to anyone, because articulating the architecture of grief to people who had not asked felt like an imposition, and Amos Hale had spent his whole life being careful about imposing. He did not speak about Cora at the shelter except once, to a young volunteer named Denise, who had asked him directly, after knowing him for several months, why he came every week when most volunteers burned out or drifted after a year or two. He had looked at her for a moment, gauging, the way he gauged most things, and then he had said that his wife had pointed him here, and he had never found a reason to stop. Denise had not pressed further. She had the good instinct to recognize when an answer was complete. The shelter itself was a long, low building tucked between a laundry and a storage facility on Clement Street, close enough to the bus line that people could find it without a car, which mattered. It ran on donations and grants, and the labour of roughly 40 regular volunteers, most of whom came monthly or twice a month, and a handful of whom came every week. The long tables were laminate. The chairs were stackable metal with mismatched donated cushions, and on one wall near the back there were crayon drawings made by children who came in with parents on Saturday mornings, taped up by Paulette, because she believed the room should show that it belonged to the people who used it. Amos had looked at those drawings many times over the years and thought about what it meant to a child to see their work on a wall in a place their family had to come to. He had never fully resolved the question. He left the drawings where they were because Paulette had put them there, and Paulette was right about the room in ways he respected. The director was a woman named Paulette, 43, sharp, perpetually under-resourced, the kind of administrator who knew exactly how much toilet paper was left in the supply closet at any given moment because she had to know. She had taken over the directorship 7 years ago when the previous director retired, and one of the first things she had done was sit down with Amos in the small office near the walk-in and ask him what the kitchen needed. Not what he wished for, not what would be nice, what it needed. He had given her a list, 3 items, all inexpensive, all specific. A second colander, a digital probe thermometer because the one they had read 2 degrees cold, and he had been compensating for that for years without telling anyone. And a proper knife roll to replace the block that was taking up 18 inches of counter space for blades that could be stored more efficiently. She ordered all 3 the same week. He had respected her from that conversation and continued to respect her without revision for the 7 years since, which was not something he could say about many people he had worked alongside. She did not make a fuss over Amos, partly because he would have deflected it, and partly because his presence was so consistent that fussing felt absurd, like expressing admiration for the building's plumbing. He was structural. He was load-bearing in ways that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with continuity. What Paulette did not know, what nobody at Clement Street knew, was that Amos had spent the last 4 months managing a slow decline that he had kept almost entirely to himself. His left knee had been deteriorating for 2 years. Bone on bone, the orthopedist had told him. Cartilage gone. The joint running on friction it was not designed to sustain. The surgery that might correct it was not covered at the insurance tier he could afford, and the tier that covered the surgery cost $312 more per month than he could manage without cutting the electric or the food. He was not going to cut the electric in November, and he was not going to cut the food. So the surgery remained on a list of things that were true and not currently possible. The category of fact he had a great deal of experience maintaining without bitterness. He managed the knee with over-the-counter anti-inflammatory medication, a compression wrap he had ordered from a discount site, and a deliberate adjustment to his gait that spread the load differently and reduced the worst of the grinding. It worked well enough on flat ground and on the level tile of the shelter kitchen in most sections. The kitchen had a stretch of buckled tile near the pass-through, the same buckle that had been reported to the building's landlord 11 times over, 7 years with no result, and on that section of tile the adjusted gait did not help. He had taken to standing slightly sideways when he worked the pass-through, right hip angled toward the window, which put the weight on a different plane and kept the worst of the grinding down. It cost him a few seconds of reach and a small awkwardness of angle that he had compensated for without letting it slow the line. Nobody had noticed, or if they had noticed, they had not said anything, and that suited him. In the second week of November, the knee gave out a new signal. Not the grinding he had learned to work around, a dull mechanical thing he could compartmentalize, but a sharper thing, higher in the joint, travelling up into the hip and down toward the shin, and a swelling that appeared by Wednesday, and did not reduce the way previous swelling had, reduced with 2 days of ice and rest. He called his doctor on Tuesday, described the change in symptoms, and was told to come in Thursday. The appointment was 12 minutes long. The doctor looked at the 3-month-old x-rays and ordered new ones and told Amos, in the even-tempered voice of a professional who delivers difficult information to patients who cannot afford its solutions more often than she would, like that the joint had progressed significantly. She used the word urgent. She used the phrase level of deterioration inconsistent with continued weight-bearing activity. She said he needed to be off the knee as much as possible for the next several weeks, and that they needed to have a serious conversation about the surgery timeline, Amos asked Saturday. She held his gaze and said the next several weeks included Saturday. He sat in her office for a moment after she said that, not moving, not responding, just processing. She waited because she had enough experience with patients who received hard news to know that the first moment after delivery is not fulfilling. Then he said he understood, and he thanked her, which he did sincerely, and he went home on the bus, holding the railing with both hands the way he had not needed to do until this year. At home he called Paulette and got her voicemail and left a message that was careful and specific, giving the practical facts without editorializing, and then he sat down and wrote her a note in longhand on the notepad he kept on the counter. The note listed the names of 2 other volunteers who knew the kitchen well enough to manage Saturday prep without him, noting which one was stronger on soups and which was better with the griddle, and included his estimate of the walk-in inventory as of his last visit, and the approximate quantities needed for the expected guest count that weekend. He folded the note and addressed it, and set it on the counter to be mailed in the morning, and then he made tea and sat at the kitchen table, in the quiet that Cora's absence left, the particular quiet of an apartment that has been a home, and is now only a residence for one. And he felt, for the first time in 30 years, the specific weight of a Saturday he would not be at. It was not self-pity. He was clear about that with himself. It was something more precise than self-pity, something closer to grief for the continuity of a thing he had tended a long time. The way a gardener feels when a late frost takes something they have been growing through many seasons. He sat with it until the tea was gone, and then he washed the cup and went to bed. Paulette got the voicemail Friday morning and called him back, and he answered, and they spoke for 8 minutes. He was calm and factual, which she had expected. She was calm and factual in return, which she had learned to be around him because it was what he needed, and she had enough respect for him to give him what he needed without inflating it. After she hung up, she sat at her desk for a moment and did not look at anything in particular. She was thinking about the knee in the surgery and the insurance gap and the compression wrap, information he had offered in the plainest possible terms as logistics, not as hardship. No implication in any of it, no reaching. She was also thinking about something that had surfaced during the conversation, not as a disclosure, but as a logistical aside, something Amos had offered the way offered all difficult facts, without reaching. His son Marcus, who ran a construction and development company, had offered to cover the surgery twice, and that Amos had declined both times because he did not want to be a burden to his child. Paulette sat with that for a long moment. Then she went to manage the Friday prep. The information settled somewhere below the level of her conscious management and kept its own counsel while she worked. Saturday morning, the shelter opened without Antamos. Volunteer Denise arrived at 7:30 and went through the prep the way she had learned it, mostly from watching him, and the morning ran. The food was prepared and served, and the guests were fed, and nobody went without, which was the thing that had to be true, and it was true. But something in the room's texture was different in the way that a room is different when the person who sets its temperature is absent. You feel it in the air before you can name it, in the way conversations are slightly louder than usual because the low, steady frequency that had been moderating them is gone. Denise noticed it in the first hour. She noticed it in the way the new volunteer kept looking to the pass-through for someone who was not there. The eyes going to the space reflexively, the way eyes go to a light that has been switched off. She noticed it in the way the guests who came in every week paused at the kitchen window with an expression she could only describe as a half-beat of hesitation, like reaching for a familiar doorknob in the dark and finding it 3 inches to the left of where you expected. One regular, a man named Carter, who had been coming to Clement Street for 9 years, and who always sat at the 3rd table from the door by the window, always came in, always nodded at Amos specifically before he sat down, because that nod was part of his Saturday the way the table was part of his Saturday, the way the coffee was part of his Saturday, came through the door that morning, and did not nod at anyone because there was no one to nod at, and sat down with his tray and looked at his food for a moment before he ate it. Denise saw that from the pass-through and felt something catch in her chest, The particular sensation of watching someone manage an absence they were not prepared for and were managing without complaint, because that was what you did. She kept the line moving and did not say anything to anyone about what she was feeling, because there was work to do, and the work was what Amos himself would have said to focus on. What Denise did after the meal shift end and the cleanup was done and the other volunteers had left was sit down at the small table in the back of the kitchen with her phone and look up Marcus. She had heard Amos mention his son exactly twice over the 6 years she had known him. The first time had been years ago, a passing comment during a slow stretch of the morning about Marcus finishing a project in another city. The pride in his voice compressed and careful. The pride of a man who loves a person extravagantly and has decided not to embarrass them with it. The second time had been the previous spring, when a guest had mentioned a new development going up near the waterfront, and Amos had said, quietly and without drawing attention to it, that his son's company did that kind of work. Denise had filed it away the way she filed away most things Amos said, which was carefully and permanently, because she had learned early that he did not say things twice. She looked up the waterfront development and found it without difficulty. She found the development company behind it on the city's business registry. The principal was Marcus Delroy Hale. She looked at the name for a moment. She thought about the compression wrap and the declined offers, and the note Paulette had described to her that morning, handwritten, precise, worried about the other volunteers. Then she opened the company's contact page and wrote a message identifying herself as a volunteer coordinator at Clement Street Community Shelter, saying she had a personal matter concerning someone Marcus would know and asking if he would be willing to speak with her. He called in 4 hours. She had not expected 4 hours. He was direct and not unkind, which was his father in a different register, younger and faster, but made of the same material, and she could hear within the first half-minute that he already knew something, was off because his father had not called on Sunday 3 weeks in a row, and Amos called every Sunday at 7 in the evening without fail, the same 7 year after year, the kind of constancy that, when it breaks even once, sounds its own alarm. She told him what she knew without commentary. The knee, the 2 refusals, the surgery gap, the note his father had left for Paulette with the inventory count, and the griddle notes for the substitute volunteer, the 30 years, the canvas bag with the spice blend, the way Carter had looked at his plate that morning. She did not ask Marcus for anything. She said she had not thought it was her place to reach out, and that Amos would not want her to have done it, but that she had decided a son should know the full shape of what his father was living with. Because she was not certain Amos had told him all of it, and she was right. She could hear that she was right in the quality of Marcus's silence after she finished speaking. He said, in a voice that carried the same controlled weight she recognized from his father's voice, that he had been trying to get Amos to let him help for over a year, and that every time he raised it, his father said he was managing fine and changed. The subject with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided a conversation is over. Denise said she knew. She said she imagined that was exactly how it had gone. Marcus said, thank you, and she said you're welcome, and both of them meant it without any ceremony around it, and she hung up and looked at the kitchen where Amos's folding chair sat empty behind the pass-through, and then she put on her coat and went home. Marcus drove to his father's apartment the next morning. He had a key because Amos had given him a key years ago when his eyesight had started requiring readers, a practical measure, no sentiment attached to its giving. He used it after knocking and waiting long enough to hear the footsteps. Slow and careful, in a way they had not been the last time Marcus had visited, which had been 4 months ago. Gap that now felt like a failure of attention, though he had not understood it as one at the time. Amos opened the door and looked at his son and did not speak for a moment. He was wearing the cardigan with the patch on the left elbow, the patch he had sewn himself with thread that did not quite match, and his expression was one Marcus recognized from childhood. The expression of a man who has been found doing something he intended to do privately and is assembling his response to that fact. Not angry. Not embarrassed exactly. something more like the dignity of a person who has arranged things a certain way for reasons, and is now being asked to explain the arrangement. Marcus came in. He did not stand in the doorway and make a speech because his father did not have patience for speeches dressed up as concern. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same round table where Marcus had done homework for 16 years, where Cora had set her coffee in the mornings and Amos had read his newspaper in the evenings, and he said plainly that he had heard about the knee, the full version, not the version Amos had been offering on the Sunday calls, the fine version, the managing fine version, but the one that included the grade of deterioration and the surgery gap, and the note to Paulette about who should manage the griddle when he couldn't be there. Amos sat down across from him. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at the table for a long moment, and then he said he did not want to be a burden, which was the sentence Marcus had known was coming and which he had prepared for, not with an argument, but with something more specific than an argument. He said that he understood why his father felt that way, and that he respected it, and that he also needed his father to hear something. He said that when he was 8 years old, he had a bad ear infection that his father had driven him to the clinic for at 11 at night in January, in the cold, the old car that needed warming up, and had sat with him in the waiting room for 3 hours, without once making him feel that it was an inconvenience, and that when Marcus had apologized, the way children apologize for needing things, Amos had told him that this is what it means to love someone. You show up. You do not keep score. Marcus said he remembered that every word of it, because children remember the things their parents say in the moments they most need to hear them. He said he was asking his father to let him show up, not as a debt, not as an accounting, as a son doing the same thing his father had done for him his whole life. Amos was quiet after that for long enough that the refrigerator's hum was audible between them. Then he looked at the curtains and the skillet and the 5 steps to the door, and he said, "All right." Just those 2 words, with a fullness in them that 2 words rarely carry, the fullness of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has finally agreed to set it down. The surgery was scheduled within the week. Marcus handled the insurance coordination and the orthopedist's office and the gap between what was covered and what the surgery cost, and he did all of it without reporting to his father, without summarizing the process, without any of the performance that would have made Amos feel managed rather than loved. He called ahead to Paulette and asked whether the shelter was covered for the recovery period, which the doctor had estimated at 6 to 8 weeks, and when Paulette said they were stretched on experienced kitchen help, he arranged a donation from a catering company he worked with, covering the Saturday meals for the duration, attributed on the shelter's records, not to Marcus Company, but to an anonymous gift in support of community operations. Paulette told her volunteers as a donor had stepped up, and the Saturdays were handled. Denise looked at her across the prep table and understood without being told. The buckled tile near the pass-through was also addressed. A repair crew Marcus had arranged through a separate channel. New tile, laid on a Tuesday morning when the shelter was closed, flush with the surrounding floor, the buckle that had been reported 11 times and ignored 11 times, simply gone, as if it had never been. Paulette did not ask about it. She ran her hand over the new tile the first time she saw it and thought about the quality of a care that repairs res. Things without taking credit, and then she went back to work. The surgery went well. The orthopedist, reviewing the preoperative imaging alongside images from 2 years prior, told Marcus in the hallway that his father had been managing a level of joint deterioration that most patients his age would have been unable to work, let alone work a food service line on for months, and that whatever he had been doing to stay functional had been, in the doctor's considered opinion, a level of self-management she rarely saw. Marcus stood in that hallway and thought about the compression wrap from a discount site, the sideways stance at the pass-through, the 30 years of Saturday mornings his father had made that walk, without mentioning that it was getting harder. He felt something he could not name, something between admiration and a grief that had nothing to do with sorrow, because his father was alive and going to recover. He went back to the waiting room and sat with his phone face down and waited. Recovery was 8 weeks. Marcus came twice a week during those 8 weeks, bringing food in containers his father accepted without protest, because not accepting Marcus's cooking would have been a particular kind of insult, the insult of refusing to receive what you had given. They talked the way fathers and sons talk when years of separate adult lives have created a comfortable distance, and something has brought them, suddenly, without drama, back to the kitchen table. Marcus told his father about work, the projects, the complications. A difficult site in the warehouse district, a deal that had nearly fallen through 3 times before it held. Amos listened and asked specific questions, not polite questions, specific ones, the questions of a man who has decided to pay attention, and Marcus recognized in those questions his own capacity for attention. The thing he had learned from watching his father returned to him now from across the table. On the first Saturday of the new year, Amos came through the shelter door at 7:15. Canvas bag, apron, spice blend. The piece of fruit he had made a habit of carrying on the walk. His gait was level. The 4-block walk from the bus stop had not cost him anything it had been costing him. Paulette was at the prep table and looked up when he came through and said, "Good morning," the way you say it to someone who has always come through. That door and is coming through it, again after an absence that you registered, more than you said. He said good morning, and she moved aside at the pass-through without being asked, and he tied on his apron and looked at the walk-in the way he always looked at it. He saw the new tile. He stood still for one moment and looked at it. The seam where the old buckled section had been was clean. The new tile matching the surrounding floor, close enough that you would not notice it if you did not know where to look. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, quietly and completely, and then he turned to the prep table and got to work. He did not ask who had arranged it. He already knew, the same way he knew most things about his son, through the shape of a care that did not require announcement. Carter came in at 8:05, which was his time, and walked to the 3rd table by the window, which was his table. He looked up at the pass-through and saw Amos in the apron under the morning light, coming through the kitchen's high window, the same posture, the same economy of motion at the griddle, and something in Carter's face changed in the way a face changes. When it has been holding a tension it did not know it was holding, and the source of the tension is resolved. He nodded. Amos looked up from the griddle and nodded back, the small, clean exchange of 2 people who have trusted the same table long enough that they do not need words for the important things. Carter sat down and ate his breakfast, and for the first time in 7 Saturdays he ate it without the pause at the beginning that Denise had noticed. Denise arrived for her own shift an hour into the morning and came through the back to put her bag down and saw Anchumas at the griddle and stood in the doorway for a moment with the specific relief of someone watching a thing restored. He did not look up. That was right. He would have been embarrassed by anything that acknowledged what his return cost or meant, and she understood that because she had been paying attention for 6 years. Later, near the end of the morning, when the line had thinned and the tables were being cleared, he came out from behind the pass-through and moved through the room refilling coffee, way he always did, speaking to no one in particular and to everyone generally, the way a man does who has been a presence in a room long enough that his moving through it is itself a form of hospitality. One of the newer guests, a woman who had been coming for about 5 weeks, watched him do this and leaned to the woman beside her and asked, lo, who that was. The woman beside her, who had been coming for 3 years and who knew Amos the way you know, someone who has been part of a place you depend on, said that was Amos, and he had been here longer than most of the people who ran the place. And she said it with the matter-of-fact weight of a fact that does not need to be dressed up. The first woman nodded and watched him refill the cup of an elderly man at the far table and said nothing else. The story did not end with a ceremony or a headline or a check presented in front of a camera. That is not the shape of a life like this. What it ended with was a Tuesday evening in February when Marcus came by the apartment and they sat together at the kitchen table after dinner, the dishes done, the window showing the street outside in its bare winter light, brick and bare branch, and the amber scatter of street lamps coming on. Marcus said that Denise had told him something the week before when he had stopped by the shelter to see how the catered meals had worked out during the recovery. She had told him about the Saturday Amos missed. Not about the knee, not about the surgery, but about Carter. About the way Carter had come through the door that morning and looked at the pass-through and found no one there, and had sat down at his table with his tray and looked at his food without his nod, and about the pause before he ate. Amos listened to this and was quiet for a moment. He looked at the peacock curtains, still holding their colour in the lamplight, and at the skillet on the back burner. And then he said that Carter had been coming to that table for 9 years, since the year his daughter had stopped speaking to him, and that the table was one of a few remaining places where he felt like a person with a bad name rather than a problem with a number, and that it was worth showing up for. He said it the way he said most things that mattered, plainly, without performance, as a statement of fact that contained its own full weight, without needing decoration. Marcus looked at his father for a long moment, and then he said that he understood now, in a way he had not understood fully before, why Amos had been making that walk for 30 years. Not the abstract version of understanding, the version you assemble from admiration at a distance, but the particular, specific understanding of a person who has been given the full picture. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long to ask for it. Amos shook his head once, the small movement of a man who does not carry grievance, and said there was nothing to be sorry for. He said Marcus had always been a good son. He said it in the same voice he used at Clement Street, quiet and direct, the voice that made whoever was in the room feel seen. They sat together until the light in the window had changed all the way from afternoon to evening, the street gone from grey winter daylight to the particular amber of a city settling in for the night. And then Marcus got up and filled the kettle and made tea, and they sat with it at the table that had held them both for the better part of their lives, and the curtains held their colour, and the skillet sat on the back burner, and the quiet between them was not the pointed quiet of an absence, but the full, warm quiet of two people who are, without needing to say so, exactly where they ought to be. If there is someone in your life who has been showing up quietly, without credit, doing the thing that needs doing because they believe it matters, today might be the day to let them know you see it. Drop their name in the comments if you want to honour them, or just carry them in mind. And if a story about a life of faithfulness recognised at last is the kind of story you return to, there is another one waiting for you right now.